Hello all, this is the Owl, and today we'll be looking at the second chunk of Shibuya Goldfish. And when I say second chunk, I mean that we'll be doing both volumes 2 and 3, you'll see why. And yes, the birds have been going insane outside of my window as of late. Apologies, there's not much I can do about them that doesn't involve a shotgun. In a nutshell, Volume 2 on its own just doesn't work. But together, well, this is where the manga starts getting better than it has any bloody right to be. You'll see what I mean in just a bit. That said, as you have so correctly pointed out, my intros have indeed been getting a little flabby and self-indulgent again, so let's trim the gristle and dive right back on in. We start out Volume 2, seeing people on the street discussing the dubious existence of a legendary Shibuya figure. Something of an urban legend, in fact. The Shibuya Sable, apparently a violent, dangerous homeless man known for hanging around Miyashita Park, brawling with gangsters, and sure enough, we cut on over to said brawl. It's not terribly important as said gangsters get eaten by the goldfish at the very outset of the invasion, but do note the surroundings. We'll be going into this in just a bit, but I think this is integral to what the author is trying to say with this character. It's a tent city in the middle of Miyashita Park. Oh, and if you haven't realized yet, Volume 2 is mostly kind of a break from the main plotline, with it sort of converging back in later. Yeah, this manga is very strangely structured in places, so we'll be instead focusing on other characters for a time. We meet a few of said new characters, such as a high schooler, Aki, and her little brother Haru. They were, to their minds at least, saved by Sable when her school was attacked by the fish, and they ended up teaming up with the Yakuza as well as some other survivors, albeit reluctantly, to secure the school. Sable plans to escape somehow, and they begin exploring the crawl space, which also gives us lots of gratuitous panty shots, because for some unknown bloody reason, it wouldn't be a what the fuckalypse story without also being ridiculously horny. We do gradually get drip-fed insights into the mysterious Sable's character. There's some sort of history here, as he's chosen to be homeless, as this gives him the freedom to live his life however he wishes. All he really wants to do is eat, sleep, and do his own thing around Shibuya. We are also shown a little bit more of the author's thesis here, in that Shibuya's affluence does in fact hide some pretty dark edges. Back at the main story, no, not the main story, but the other main story, this manga man, they clamber down out of the crawl space. And yeah, honestly, this sequence is actually pretty dope. They emerge into the silent staff room full of half-eaten corpses in search of keys. In particular, the key Sable is after, the key to the cafeteria. However, they are attacked by the goldfish, giving us a good chance to see just how formidable Sable is, as he uses his surroundings as well as various improvised weapons to absolutely crush the fish in a sequence that weirdly reminds me of Goblin Slayer of all things. Well, without all the weird sexual assault scenes, man, that manga needs to pick a tone. Anyway, we get a bit of Sable's backstory. The Yakuza, who I swear I am going to call Yaguza at some point, thanks Civvie, and how he fought a one-sided guerrilla war with them over what he viewed as a general disrespect for Shibuya itself. And as we begin to snap back to the present, you know, where we finished up the last video, I think now might be a good time to try and puzzle out exactly what Aoi is referring to with this character. At least from my perspective, at this point in the story. As always, if you aren't into the cultural stuff, feel free to skip to the next chapter. So, Sable. Where do I even start? Well, while we will get a lot more detail later, where we are now in the story, this character seems to be a nod to two specific things. Naturally, this is all just my interpretation, and I would be very curious to hear your interpretations in the comments, but just hear me out. First up, Sable is Violence Jack. No, I'm not even kidding. Gone guy's bug nuts insane, and yet impossibly influential and important post-apocalyptic manga series, yeah, you're welcome to go and watch my video on it if you want to know more, is quite a read even today. And its titular character, the similarities do not end at Sable's appearance. Both are seemingly superhuman anti-hero wildcards, sort of leading a group of survivors in a post-apocalyptic world, and they do indeed seem to interact with other characters in a similar fashion, i.e. somewhere between disdain, utilitarianism, and some weird black-nailed form of reluctant heroism, and both have very odd backstories, which again, we'll get into way later when it comes to Sable. So yes, that's the simple part. He's what the fuckalypse Violence Jack, but without him turning out to be a resurrected character from another series and also kind of Satan's memories. Man, that manga was a head trip. The second part, however, is a bit more complex. See, Japan, and particularly Tokyo's attitude towards and treatment of the homeless, is both rather contentious and hard to fully pin down. The situation is a little bit better now, but in a nutshell, during the lost decades heralded by the economic bubble of post-World War II Japan bursting, and an incredible number of people streaming out of the country and into metropolitan centers like Tokyo, homelessness and vagrancy became a real problem. Tent and cardboard cities and parks started to become commonplace, and while these were nowhere near as dangerous or as wild as what you'd find in the West or, you know, my home country, they were still a concern, both in terms of safety and in terms of general nuisance to the residents, who rapidly became worried about increasing crime rates in the nearby areas, as well as problematic drunks and even some drug users accosting passers-by, particularly women. So yes, while public perception was mixed, the biggest part of the issue was systemic. See, it's hard to emphasize just how much of a bureaucracy Japan is. An example from my own experiences over there. When I arrived, I had to register with my town and set up all of my accounts and utilities. However, foreign names do not always translate perfectly into Japanese characters. In my case, the syllable t had no equivalent and was written as tei in one place and chi in another, and this resulted in my registered name and the name on my bank account having one katakana character different, despite the pronunciation in English being completely identical. This one tiny issue caused me endless problems for the next 5 years. For instance, I couldn't set up any sort of automatic utility, pension, tax, or insurance payments, or even have my monthly pay deposited into said account in any sort of direct manner, as the names were technically different. So of course I tried to close the account, but I couldn't, because despite it obviously being me and using my signature, my official name and the account holders' names were different, and thus I could not close it. Oh, and I couldn't open any other bank accounts within the entire prefecture for much the same reason. I would have to close that account first. So I went to the registry to request that they change the spelling, only to be informed that I couldn't. There was literally no way to change it, even though it had been their error. My foreigner ID and my registration had been done under a specific name, and the only way this could be modified is if I got married or was adopted into a Japanese family. Yes, they understood that they had made the mistake, but it could not be remedied because they just did not have the tools to do so. Long story short, that account remains open today, and I had to leave the prefecture to resolve the issue. I suppose that all 100 yen remaining will likely continue to accrue interest for any wild oats I happen to sow over there. And of course, that last part was not serious. Now, in terms of the homeless, there is a rudimentary social support system available, but it can't, or at least couldn't be utilized without a fixed address. See the problem? And this left people who, in all rights, should have been able to receive payments, simply unable to due to a bureaucratic oversight. However, things only got uglier from there. Some of the more affluent wards and areas were getting fed up with the homeless, who, in their view, simply refused to do anything about their situation, so they decided to basically force them out, herding them into a single ward, the now notorious Sanya, which became likely the worst place in Japan. You can actually find nods to Sanya in quite a few other manga. I think great teacher Onizuka went into it a bit, but it's been a long time since I read that, so I may be mistaken. However, the most notable one that comes to mind is in the incredible Kengan Ashura and its Ward 0, which is a pretty clear and direct nod to the Sanya debacle. Shibuya, however, is an even messier story. Remember that panel I told you to remember? Well, homeless folks that didn't end up in Sanya generally lived in Miyashita Park, in a large and fairly well-structured tent city. Not half bad as homeless encampments tend to be, and despite the area's attempts, they proved quite difficult to evict legally. This led Shibuya to essentially sell the area to Nike for redevelopment in the hopes that the megacorporation would do their dirty work instead. The homeless were instructed to vacate, and when they did not, the tent cities were torn down and their possessions were removed. And this happened a few times. While the sale of the park was eventually blocked by the government, the park itself was then completely closed to the public for several years, bulldozed, and eventually turned into a mall. And yes, this actually really pissed people off, as green spaces in Shibuya are becoming a rarity. The story doesn't end there, however, as many of the Miyashita homeless moved into Mitake Park, where the exact same thing was recently done. Closure of said park, forced eviction of the homeless, and then the redevelopment of the park, leading to a pretty widespread international condemnation of what was perceived as a backdoor eviction of undesirables, mostly because they were just shabbying up an expensive neighborhood. But yes, this is a very complicated socio-political issue, and not one I am going to take a stance on in this dumb little manga video. But I have a feeling that the character of Sable does, at least in part, represent an angry as hell finger pointed at the treatment of the homeless in terms of the Miyashita Park evictions. Anyways, back to the story. We get a bit more with Aki and Sable and see the plan that they'll be using to escape. That night, at midnight, they'll use a window to get out of the building, then make a mad dash for the cafeteria, which, if they're successful and manage to get there without being eaten, will give them a fortifiable and well-provisioned position to defend until they're rescued. However, the Yakuza are leery of this for obvious reasons, mostly because Sable has been killing them like, popcorn? Do you kill popcorn? This is my brain on baby amounts of sleep. Sable does receive a little more characterization. He is a creature of id, sleeping, eating, and doing whatever the hell he wants to in the moment. Again, we will learn a bit more about him later, but he will remain a wild card for a good while yet. That night, Aki is awakened from a nightmare by the Yakuza, who want to take her and her brother and leave without Sable to use them as human shields. And that's all we promise. They demand that she turns over her key, but they quickly realize that Sable has predicted this move already and switched the key for another one. And before this can go any further, they begin hearing the creepy goldfish voices and realize that things are about to go south fast. And sure enough, in another of this manga's surprisingly great double spreads, someone, presumably Sable, has left a window open and a whole bunch of smaller fish begin floating around inside. Aki realizes the truth. She, her little brother, the Yakuza, and all of the rest of their little survivor group were actually just bait for Sable, a simple distraction to let him bypass the fish and escape to the cafeteria on his own. Yeah, anti-hero, I guess with an emphasis on the anti. They bolt for the cafeteria themselves in a desperate dash, losing quite a few more members on the way. But as they arrive, indeed finding it unlocked, it's already completely full of fish. Oh boy. Someone needs to call Nicholas Seafort on this one. There's a reference that nobody is going to get. Haru actually nearly gets nommed on, but someone begins going through the fish like a buzzsaw. Sable has returned, happily nibbling on some buns he found. Aki is overjoyed to see him, but he walks straight past her and towards the exit as she begins to vomit, along with everyone else. Turns out he's set off some sort of improvised gas bomb, as he doesn't care about them at all. He just wants to kill the goldfish for messing with Shibuya. We get a protracted battle sequence where Sable kills the fish in pretty impressive numbers, as well as eating some of them raw, avoiding injury with Ursat's arm made of chains, and just going more ham than an Iowan Christmas, while he does end up somewhat banged up. Chains or no chains, he wipes out dozens of fish with evident enjoyment, all while singing... Okay, this is actually a children's nursery rhyme. I can play the music, but for some reason anything with lyrics gets copyright claimed. Go figure. This is that friggin' Gantz song all over again. And they begin to realize that he is crazier than a sack of weasels, and maybe scarier than the fish in his own right. Yeah, sure enough, we learn that he's that character, and he tells Aki that she and the other survivors are on their own, and that if they are too weak to save themselves, they do not serve any sort of valid purpose in this new world. And furthermore, when she starts to beg that he looks after her brother, he instructs her that if she does care about him that much, she should protect him with her own life first, rather than those of others, before sodding off. Okay, fair point. And it actually sort of works, as soon Aki uses a cleaver to kill an attacking fish. Tough love? ? Meanwhile, we see Sable return to the homeless camp in Miyashita. Yes, this must be before all that nastiness we discussed before. Finding a note from the electrician. We'll meet this character later, by the way. We see a news broadcast informing us that the government has basically given up on Shibuya, as Sable walks down the street, munching a donut and talking to someone on a walkie-talkie, presumably the electrician. And we get a brief glimpse of some other survivors, including another idle-ish looking lady, a strange gentleman opening a briefcase, and mysterious figures on rooftops. Yeah, say what you like about the story and the structure being bonkers, but the use of paneling here is just great. Aoi is setting up a mystery, and so the panels form a puzzle. That's just neat. And most of these characters, while not crucial to the story, will actually be introduced in due course. As Sable enters the sewers, he runs directly into our protagonist Hajime and Elisa, the two remaining from Volume 1, and yes, let the actual plot resume, I guess. We find out what happened at the end of Volume 1, and how they survived. Well, no, we actually don't. Not yet, at least. We see they were surrounded by fish and seemingly doomed, only to awaken alone on the street the next morning. Okay? We do actually get a rather sweet little interlude where Hajime basically tells Elisa that he followed her because he's developing feelings for her and returns her scrunchie. Yeah, he's a bit damp, but he's still a really likable character. And not quite as frustrating as the protagonists of this sort of story tend to be. After they wandered the sewers, lost for days, they ran into Sable, and it goes about how you'd expect it to. Oh yes, right. I wanted to mention this. Aoi does this thing where his characters expand outside of, or even wander between panels sometimes. It's another effect that I've always loved, and the only manga I can immediately recall doing this is My Hero Academia. We see that Sable has established a pretty sweet camp here. Food, weapons, a rudimentary bed, and fire. Hajime asks him if they can borrow some food and water, as they're starving, which he agrees to far too easily. Yeah, you two, don't make me hit you with an akbar, especially when he tells them that after, he will take them to his primary base, Fukutoshin Line near Shibuya Station, an actual subway line and the deepest in Japan, almost 40 meters deep in places, allegedly where other survivors are already living. They emerge up into the Akarie building, an iconic skyscraper in the area. And Sable's heel turn comes almost immediately as he slashes Hajime's hand, causing him to bleed and attract fish. A new breed this time, pearl scales. Basically the mancubus of the goldfish worlds. And that's basically where Volume 2 ends. We do get a weird little epilogue with these other site segments giving us hints towards how exactly this all came to be. All we see is a young elementary age girl who allegedly had some sort of breakdown, and everyone finds her kind of off. We see that they are not wrong. At home, she drags a dead, bloody dog upstairs and feeds it to her goldfish. Thank you, Aoi. There's a sentence that I never thought I would have to say. And then we see her, covered in blood, speaking in that creepy, broken way the goldfish do. Don't worry, this will make, well, I won't say sense, but I will say more sense later. Anyway. Volume 3 starts out with, okay, I do need to point this out. At the start of every volume, we get a really fun and well-constructed, I guess you'd call it a timeline recap of the core characters and events here It's not really crucial to understanding this series, but it is just so helpful, and I really do groove the presentation. I swear, Nihei, your manga would have benefited so much from one of these. Anyway, we see Hajime trying to find some way out of their situation, but realizing that they're sort of screwed, as Sable taunts them, basically saying he has no idea how they lived this long, but that nice guys will finish last in this new world of theirs. Their only use is as cannon fodder for the more aggressive and realistic survivors, willing to bring the ruthlessness needed to live through this new world to the table. Hajime, on the other hand, refuses to give up and is instead really pissed. He then actually has I'll give it to him, a pretty damn good idea. He dashes over to the partially eaten corpse of a policeman and retrieves his revolver to use on the fish, right? Nope. To Elisa's astonishment and Sable's annoyance, Hajime shoots out the windows above them, right near the douche's position. And yeah, this entire sequence is rocking double spread after rocking double spread. Seriously, why is the art in this allegedly terrible manga so damn good in places? As we see Hajime's plan unfolds, now they will all die unless Sable helps them. Mutually assured destruction and all that. And this does lead us to getting an intimation of what Sable's plan was. Spoiler, he's an asshole, but not a complete buttpipe. He wanted to see what the pair would do when their backs were forced to the wall. And it turns out that Hajime can be ruthless in his own right too when he has to be, catching even Sable by surprise, which means that they might be useful to him and capable of surviving. Sure enough, he barrels through the fish and tells them to basically run after him like mad bastards. And they do, somehow nearly making it out before running into, that's a boss fish. This absolute unit of a pearl scale waiting for them in the parking garage. Sable injures it and they slip past, shutting the steel doors behind them. Elisa, still pissed, nearly knifes Sable one after he attempts to strangle Hajime for his little stunt with the windows, but as it turns out, this was also a test, hers this time. As mentioned, this is just Sable's thing. Again, very violence-jack. Regardless, whoever he's talking to tells him to bring them to the base, which, as it so happens, turns out to be a stalled subway train surrounded with poo buckets to disguise their scent from the fish. Inside, they find several other survivors, including this big bugger, and he tells them that they're going to be taken to see the doctor. Okay then. The doctor turns out to be a conventionally attractive but eccentric woman by the name of Chika Yumioka, an ichthyologist, of course. But before we find out what the blithering hell she's doing in this room, we cut over to the idolish girl we mentioned earlier and see that she's actually a gyaru. A very complicated cultural phenomenon that I've gone into briefly in other videos. Let's say somewhere between punk, tomboy, and fashion victim as a massive oversimplification. You can usually spot them by their provocative clothing, fake tans, dyed hair, and often sparkly makeup. In a nutshell, gyaru exist as a sort of pushback to the traditional standards expected of Japanese girls, to be pale-skinned, demure, virginal, shy, and retiring, instead embracing dark skin, boisterousness, masculinized behavior, crazy outfits, and, at times, promiscuity. There is some overlap with the phenomenon of carnivore girls here. And yes, before someone says this in the comments, I guess this character is likely more appropriately a Ganguro, a subset of Gyaru that has fallen out of style as of late. But honestly, the differences are bloody academic. It's like the goth versus emo thing. Or, as Mrs. Owl suggested, graveyard versus cemetery. Yes, I can hear you Googling. Her family name is Otokoyama. That's pretty funny. Literally male mountain, with her nickname being Miyochi, her real name being Mio, and we see that they're carrying out some sort of plan along with the other, let's call them Sable team survivors. Or, as we'll find out later, cannon fodder might be more apropos. There's actually a fairly good subplot involving Miyochi and her best friend, Naoko. Short version, they were enemies in school, but grew to become incredibly good friends and an absolutely inseparable trio. However, the third person, a heavyset girl nicknamed Yuipo, was killed by the fish, and Naoko cruelly blamed Mio for this as she was late for their gathering. I can't show the entire thing here, obviously, but it's actually weirdly effective storytelling, and I won't lie. This little bit of backstory really did kind of make me care here. Like so much of this manga, it is way better than it has any right to be. Back with the doctor. Yeah, the structure is bizarre at times, which, again, take note Nihei. This is why a timeline recap is a very useful thing, poke poke poke. And we see her dissecting the goldfish, saying that aside from their immense size, these seem like normal goldfish. And yet, they behave very strangely. We also meet her shy assistant, Kaoru. It turns out that Sable wants her to research exactly how to beat these things, as they cannot expect any help from the outside. Only before they can discuss exactly what Sable and Chika want from them, there is a scream, and a blood-soaked Miyochi tells them that the expedition we just saw has been attacked. As Naoko was on the mission, she pleads with Sable to help her, and he's likely about to tell her to do it herself when she mentions that they were attacked by an extremely powerful and ominous fish she refers to as a white monster. And this immediately piques Sable's interest, but he quickly reveals that he is only after this whitefish. The expedition is on their own, to which Hajime and Elisa surprisingly volunteer. The heavy dude gives them some poo flares. No, seriously, these are flares packed with poo that give off vapors that apparently stun and blind the fish, as well as Chekhov's oil lantern. We see that most of the expedition were indeed wiped out, with only a handful remaining. Yeah, we're skipping a good few really gory panels here. And while Hajime's group arrive in time to save some of them, Naoko is pretty badly injured by one of the bigger fish. Sable, meanwhile, fights his way through hordes of the things, and finally spies his quarry, an enormous albino tosakin, a rare and expensive Japanese breed of goldfish that they have dubbed the Silver Princess. Bizarrely enough, the commander of the creatures, or at least it seems this way to Sable, and she is bearing down on the survivors. Hajime desperately pops their last flare, but Miyochi wants to save her injured friend, and with Elisa's help they go for it in a desperate charge, Silver Princess and her army of big boys on their heels. Hajime is able to save them by smashing the lantern and igniting some petrol, a move that always seems to work in media, but in real life, well, doesn't. All you get is a broken lamp, a puddle of fuel, and a spanking. Let's just say that I grew up on a farm without a TV. However, to their horror, the princess drives her entourage through the flames, and then Sable arrives, going Billy berserk on the fish. But despite his best efforts, the princess, demonstrating a surprising intelligence, just evades him and floats away, while her escort swarms in to attack, acting as chaff to allow her to escape. Surprisingly advanced tactics for goldfish. Oh, And you will note that the Silver Princess also has a much bigger vocabulary than the others. Oh right, we do get a resolution to the whole thing between Miyochi and her friend, which does lead to a, no, I am not kidding, really effective emotional beat, especially for a manga this damn silly. While it's a bloody close thing, and it nearly gets them all killed, Elisa's boldness wins the day, and Naoko is saved. We get to watch the pair reconcile, with the two embracing. Naoko tells Miyochi that she knew it wasn't her fault that Yuipo died, but she needed to blame someone for their friend's death, and she didn't want to blame herself, and that a lot of this came out of her own worries, that their trio was breaking up. Miyochi tells her that, yes, they had been struggling to keep their group together, with all three of them growing up and having more responsibilities, but they will never stop being friends, only then to realize that Naoko is already dead. Oh, and to add to the pathos of the situation, Miyochi is unable to even cry in case it attracts fish. Damn it, manga! That hit way harder than it had any right to. And this is what I mean. I will never claim that Shibuya Goldfish is any sort of great literary work, but it punches far above its weight class when it comes to storytelling and characters, despite its absolutely bonkers premise. And I really should read more of this writer's work. Anyway. Up on the street, we see that Sable has become hardened, partially because of the innate unfairness and sorrow of moments like what we just saw. And worse yet, despite his best efforts and a ton of dead fish, the princess has gotten away scot-free. Back at base, Chika is also frustrated that they couldn't get the princess, and we learn that she has a bizarrely foul temper that she constantly has to squash and disguise. Yeah, a nice bit of characterization there. But Sable explains that it's really, really hard. The second they go after the thing, absolute armies of fish come swarming to basically escort her away or give her a chance to escape. They realize that they're going to have to change their tactics. Meanwhile, people are astonished to see that Hajime and Elisa were not only able to return alive, but they were able to bring back survivors, including, these two who, spoiler, may actually be my favorite characters in the entire manga. We will learn more about them soon. They are just so great. While Hajime and Ko are pretty sad that they couldn't save Naoko, Miyochi thanks them profusely, as if they hadn't gone after them, she would never have had a chance to speak to her friend before her death. Yeah, they've made another solid ally here, and not half a bad one, as it turns out that Miyochi has a treasure trove of junk food and diet supplements. Oh, that's Calorie Mate down there in the bottom. I've always wondered if Bondrude's energy rations were heavily inspired by this crap, as while it certainly does fill you up and give you energy, it's like eating soggy drywall. It also had a huge advertising campaign starring Kiefer Sutherland. Japan, what even are you sometimes? And it comes in all sorts of weird flavors because, again, Japan. Anyway, the three become fast friends and enjoy the meal, until suddenly Elisa collapses unconscious. Hajime realizes that both of them have developed an icky-looking rash, one that strongly resembles fish scales. Oh yeah, and this is where the really weird stuff begins. Hajime suddenly recalls what happened when he leapt down to the street. The silver goldfish saved them, telling the other fish to leave them alone, and we suddenly switch to a full color sequence, for some reason, where Chika explains what's going on. The rash is some sort of chemical mark put on people by the princess. It emits a pheromone trail that attracts fish and will eventually kill whoever is infected. It's actually a fairly diabolical trick, as the infected will use this to lead the fish to gatherings of survivors and thus more food. Oh dear, now what are you going to do? Well, as Elisa doesn't have long, they'll need to capture the princess within 24 hours to cure her. They can't stay here as they will lead more goldfish back to base. Thus, Hajime strikes out with Elisa, arming himself to the teeth, but Sable catches him and tells them that he is not going to waste all of their weapons and supplies on a suicide mission. Hajime challenges him, and Sable says that if Hajime can even give him a single injury with a knife, he will help them out. It goes about as well as you may expect. However, as it so happens, Sable is quietly impressed by the determination on display here, and tells Hajime that the reason he can't take the weapons is that they're planning to go after the princess the next day anyway, with everyone and everything they have. Oh, and somehow Hajime left bleeding fingerprints on Sable. Oh, are we doing that thing? The other survivors aren't thrilled at the idea, but Sable tells them that if they won't help, he'll just kick them out. And yes, we also see that, despite his cool exterior, Sable is basically one giant injury walking, held together with bandages and stitches under his clothes. And with that, the mission is set. What awaits them in the lair of the Silver Princess? And, well, what exactly is going on here? That'll have to wait until next time. Anyways, before we finish for the day, I just want to say a huge thanks, as always, to our amazing patrons. Seriously, folks, without you, there is no way that we could continue to produce these videos. Cheddar, Crazy, Question Man 6, Hunting for R2D2, Inukia Koji, Calcor, Cali Caress, Opinion Custard, Philip Campbell, Piece of Yeast, Ranger Danger, Rose Montgomery, Wargle, Be Empress, Camiolan, Cheshire Quill, Endymion, Aaron Arnolds, Fluffy Burb, Jake, Jake Ramsey, Lance Goebel, Rafferty, Riss, Simone, Squid, and Yorgborg. I also really want to thank our two Aubade patrons, Jathis and Polite Crow. That is so bananas generous that I really cannot sufficiently express my gratitude. If you want to help us out and ensure that we can keep on making these videos, why not subscribe, leave a super thanks, or best of all, head on over to our Patreon. If you do the latter, you will get all sorts of benefits, including early access to videos, patron exclusive videos, a special Discord channel, and more. You'll also get access to a thing towards the end of October that should be pretty damn cool. If you're looking for something different, why not hit Mrs. Owl up for some sort of commission? She does everything from game assets to pixel art to actual art, avatars, OCs, banners, emojis, and more. Her rates are also great. Otherwise, take care all, and cheers. This is the Owl, signing off.